The coffee maker sputtered at 5:47 in the morning, the same way it had every morning for 11 years, ever since my husband Frank passed and I moved into the smaller house on Birchwood Court. I used to hate the sound. Now I find it oddly comforting, proof that something in my life still runs on schedule. I was standing at the kitchen window in my robe, watching the neighbor's sprinklers arc across the lawn in the gray early light, when my phone lit up on the counter. It was my daughter-in-law, Tiffany. 6:47 in the morning. Tiffany never called before 9. In the 3 years she'd been married to my son Nathan, I could count on one hand the number of times she'd called me directly rather than texting a terse 2-word reply to something I'd sent the family group chat. I let it ring once, twice. Then I picked up. "Diane," she said, and the way she said my name, not Mom, never Mom, told me everything about what kind of call this was going to be. "We need to talk about Thanksgiving." I poured my coffee. I set the pot down carefully. I said, "Of course. What's on your mind?" What was on her mind, it turned out, had very little to do with my mind at all. Frank and I had built our life on practicality. We weren't the kind of people who made grand gestures. He was an electrical engineer for 31 years. I worked as an office manager at a family law firm from the time our kids were in middle school until I was 62, when the senior partner retired and the new owners brought in their own staff. We owned our home. We kept a savings account. We took one real vacation every 5 years, always somewhere with a national park, always with a cooler of food in the back of the car because restaurants add up. We had 2 children. Nathan was 38 now, a project manager at a logistics company, living 40 minutes away in Crestwood with Tiffany and their 2 boys, Miles and Cooper. Our daughter, Renee, was 35 and lived 2 states over in Asheville, where she taught 2nd grade and was, in her words, happily, intentionally single. Frank died in February 7 years ago, a heart attack at 68. He was shoveling snow off the back porch. The one he'd built himself from pressure-treated lumber the summer Nathan graduated high school. And that was it. Fast. The paramedics said he likely didn't feel much. I've held on to that the way I hold on to most things, quietly and for longer than anyone knows. After Frank, I learned how to be alone. I also learned, slowly, where I actually stood in my own family. What Tiffany wanted to discuss that October morning was Thanksgiving at the Ashford Grand. The Ashford Grand was a resort about 90 minutes outside the city. She'd seen it on Instagram, she said, a converted historic estate with a championship golf course, a spa, a formal dining room that served a prix-fixe Thanksgiving menu. The prix-fixe was $240 per person, not including gratuity, beverages, or the optional harvest dessert experience, which ran an additional $35 a head. She and Nathan wanted to book it for the whole family. 8 people, Nathan and Tiffany, their 2 boys, Tiffany's parents, Alan and Cynthia, Tiffany's younger sister, Kylie, and her boyfriend, and me. "We thought it would be so special," Tiffany said. "Really bring everyone together." Nathan said you'd probably want a treat since it's the holidays and you know how much family means to you. I put my coffee cup down. I want to say I responded immediately, that I had some perfect, composed reply ready. I didn't. I stood in my kitchen in my robe, and I looked at the sprinklers still turning in slow arcs outside, and I thought about the way Tiffany had said, Nathan said you'd probably want to treat. Like it was a given, like it was something we'd established long ago. Like I was a line item in their holiday planning that had been confirmed before she even dialed. "How much are we talking, total?" I asked. She did the math for me, brightly. $240 per person, times 8, was $1,920. Plus gratuity. She suggested 20%, since it's a nice place, which was $384. Plus beverages, which she estimated conservatively at $30 per adult, so another $180. And the dessert experience, which she really thought the boys would love. So somewhere around $2,600 or $2,700, she said, depending. There was a pause. I think she expected me to say, "That sounds wonderful, send me the link." I said, "Let me think about it and I'll get back to you this week." The silence that followed was brief but full. "Oh," she said. "Of course." I need to explain something about the years after Frank died, because it matters. For the first 18 months, I was in a kind of fog. I went through the motions of my life. Grocery shopping, church on Sundays, lunch with my friend Harriet every other Wednesday. But I wasn't really present for any of it. Nathan came by weekly in the beginning, then monthly. Then on the major holidays when Tiffany's schedule allowed. I understood. He had a life, children, a demanding job. I didn't want to be the mother who required constant maintenance. But there was a specific moment, about 2 years after Frank passed, that I've returned to many times since. Nathan and Tiffany had come for Easter. Tiffany had spent most of the meal talking about renovating their kitchen. The quartz countertops, the farmhouse sink, the custom range hood, and at some point she mentioned, offhandedly, that they were a little stretched with the renovation costs and might need to lean on family a bit for summer activities for the boys. 2 weeks later, Nathan called and asked if I could cover the boys' summer camp. $1,100 total. I said yes. That was the first yes. There were others. The fall sports registration, the spring break trip to Florida. I didn't go. I just funded it. The newer laptop for Nathan's home office, because his old one couldn't handle the video calls. The birthday dinner for Tiffany's 30th at a steakhouse, where I watched her order a $40 cocktail and 2 appetizers, and then accepted my credit card without ceremony when the check arrived. I kept saying yes, because I told myself this was what family did. I told myself Frank would have wanted me to be generous. I told myself the boys needed things, and that being a grandmother meant giving. But somewhere between the summer camp and the steakhouse, I had started to feel something I didn't have a word for at the time. It wasn't quite resentment. It was more like erasure. Like I had become a function rather than a person. Like my presence at any given gathering was primarily useful for what I could provide, and everything else about me. The 31 years I'd managed that law office. The fact that I'd read more books in my life than most people owned. The way Frank used to say I had the steadiest nerves of anyone he'd ever met had quietly become irrelevant. I didn't say anything. I'm not sure I even fully admitted it to myself. Until Thanksgiving, I thought about Tiffany's call for 4 days. I ran the numbers. My Social Security came to just under $2,000 a month. I had retirement savings that I was drawing from carefully, the way Frank and I had planned. The house was paid off. I lived modestly. $2,600 was not nothing. $2,600 was my grocery budget for 5 months. But it wasn't really the money. Or it wasn't only the money. It was the assumption. It was, Nathan said you'd probably want to treat. It was the fact that no one had asked me if I wanted to spend Thanksgiving at a resort 90 minutes away. Sitting across a formal table from Alan and Cynthia, who had never once asked me a question about my own life that wasn't related to the grandchildren. It was that Renee hadn't even been mentioned, because Renee didn't have children and didn't fit neatly into the tableau Tiffany was assembling. I called Renee on the 4th day. She answered on the 2nd ring, the way she always did. Mom, what's wrong? I laughed. Why does something have to be wrong? Because you sound like you're about to be very reasonable about something unreasonable. I told her about the call. I told her about the resort and the prefix and the $2,600 and the way Tiffany had said, Nathan said you'd probably want a treat without pausing the way you say something you believe to be settled fact. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mom, what do you actually want to do for Thanksgiving? And I realized, sitting in my kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, that no one had asked me that, possibly in years. I want to go to the Homestead Inn in Vermont, I said. It came out immediately, like I'd been holding it back without knowing. Your father and I always talked about going. We never did. Then go, Renee said. I can't just. Mom, you're 67 years old. You are allowed to spend Thanksgiving wherever you want. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. Then I opened my laptop and I booked a room at the Homestead Inn in Stowe, Vermont for 4 nights over Thanksgiving week. A king room with a mountain view and a fireplace. Breakfast included. The rate was $210 a night. I paid for all 4 nights up front. I didn't tell anyone. I called Nathan 2 days before Thanksgiving, not to ask permission and not to confess. I'd thought carefully about the timing. If I told him too early, there would be too much room for the conversation that I didn't want to have. The one where I was managed and negotiated with and made to feel that my feelings were a logistical problem requiring a solution. If I told him the day before, he would say I was being dramatic. 2 days felt right. Enough time to make arrangements, not enough time for prolonged pressure. "Hey, Mom," he said, distracted. I could hear the boys in the background, something crashing, someone laughing. Normal Thursday afternoon sounds. "Nathan, I wanted to let you know. I won't be able to make Thanksgiving this year. I'm actually leaving tomorrow morning." A pause. "What do you mean, leaving?" "I booked a trip. I'm going to Vermont for the week." "Stowe, there's an inn up there your father, and I always meant to visit." Another pause, longer. "Mom, Tiffany already confirmed the reservation at the Ashford Grand. For 8 people." "I know. I'm sorry for the short notice. You'll want to call and adjust the reservation." "Adjust. He stopped. I could hear him moving into another room, away from the noise. "The reservation is for 8 people, Mom, including you." "I understand. You'll need to let them know it's 7. "But he lowered his voice. "Tiffany's parents are coming. Kylie is coming. It's a whole thing." "It sounds like a lovely gathering," I said. "I hope everyone has a wonderful time." "Mom." His voice had shifted into something firmer, a tone I'd heard before, the one that meant he was about to make a case. You know that Tiffany went to a lot of effort to plan this, and we were counting on." He stopped himself before he finished the sentence. "But we both knew how it ended, counting on you to pay for it." I let the silence stand for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said gently, "I love you, Nathan. I'll call when I get there safely. Give the boys a hug from me." I hung up before he could respond. I drove to Vermont the next morning. I left at 6 and stopped once for gas and a sandwich at a rest area in New Hampshire, where a man was walking a very old yellow lab who moved like he'd earned every slow step. I gave the dog a piece of my turkey on wheat and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely lighthearted. The Homestead Inn was everything the photos had promised. White clapboard against a gray November sky. A stone fireplace in the lobby that was already lit when I checked in. The woman at the front desk, whose name tag said Patrice, handed me an actual key, not a key card, and told me the maple French toast at breakfast was worth setting an alarm for. She was right. I spent 4 days in Stowe, Vermont, doing largely nothing of consequence, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. I walked the trail along the river each morning with a cup of coffee from the inn's dining room. I read 2 novels. I sat in front of my fireplace for an embarrassing number of hours and watched it snow on Tuesday afternoon, the kind of light snow that catches the last of the afternoon light and makes everything look like the inside of a glass paperweight. I thought about Frank. I talked to him a little. I said, "We should have done this sooner." I felt without question that he agreed. My phone buzzed periodically. Nathan, twice. Tiffany, once. A text that said only, "I hope you're happy with yourself," which I read and set face down on the nightstand. Renee called on Thanksgiving morning, and we talked for 40 minutes about everything and nothing, the way we used to when she was in college, and called home on Sunday nights. "How is it?" she asked. "It's the best Thanksgiving I've had in a long time," I said, and I meant it. What I hadn't told Nathan. What I hadn't told anyone except Harriet, my oldest friend, over coffee the week before I left, was the other part of the story. Harriet knew because Harriet had known me for 34 years. She knew me before Frank. She'd sat with me in the hospital the night he died, and again 2 days later when I had to call the insurance company for the first time, and couldn't remember my own account number. She knew things about me that my children didn't know because they'd never thought to ask. What she knew, and what no one else in my life seemed to remember, was this: the Ashford Grand, the historic resort where Tiffany had planned to celebrate Thanksgiving, the estate with the championship golf course and the formal dining room, and the optional harvest dessert experience. I had worked there for 7 years, not as a guest, as the director of administrative operations. I'd taken the position 3 years after Frank died, when the partners at my old firm retired, and I found myself at 63, needing something to do with my days that wasn't grief. A friend of a friend knew the resort's ownership group. I had 30 years of office management behind me. They hired me in October of 2019, and I worked there until the fall of 2023, when a minor health matter required a surgery and a longer recovery than I'd expected. And I made the decision, practical, clear-eyed, Frank would have approved, to retire for real this time. During those years, I had reorganized their vendor contracts, overhauled their event booking system, and supervised the renovation of their East Wing administrative offices. I knew the name of every full-time employee on the property. I knew that the walk-in refrigeration in the main kitchen had been replaced in 2021, and that the sommelier, a man named Drew, had been with the resort for longer than the current general manager. When Tiffany had described the Ashford Grand to me in glowing terms that October morning, "It's this gorgeous historic estate. I saw it on Instagram." I had listened without saying a word, not because I was being sneaky, not because I was planning something. I simply didn't see the point. Tiffany didn't ask me if I knew it. She didn't ask me anything about my life before I became, in her accounting, Miles and Cooper's grandmother and Nathan's convenient financial resource. In 3 years of dinners and holiday gatherings and birthday parties for my grandsons, she had never once asked me what I'd done with my time after Frank died. She'd never asked about my work, my years at the law firm, the second career I'd built at 63 out of stubbornness and a genuine need to be useful. So I listened, and I said, "Let me think about it." On the last morning in Vermont, I sat at breakfast with my maple French toast and my coffee, and I wrote a letter. I'd been composing it in my head since Tuesday, in pieces, between chapters and walks and fireside hours. I wrote it to Nathan, but I meant parts of it for Tiffany too, and I meant parts of it for myself. I told him about the 7 years at the Ashford Grand. I told him about the vendor contracts and the East Wing renovation, and Drew the sommelier, who I was reasonably certain would still be working the Thanksgiving service that his wife had so carefully planned. I told him that I had not said anything in October because no one had asked, and that this was, in the kindest possible terms, something worth thinking about. I told him that I loved him, and that I loved his boys completely, in the particular way that only grandmothers understand, fierce and irrational and bottomless. I told him that none of what I was about to say changed that. I told him that I had spent the years since his father died trying to be useful to this family in the way I thought was expected of me, and that at some point along the way, being useful had become the only role anyone seemed to need me to fill, that there was a difference between generosity and assumption, that I was happy to be generous, that I was no longer willing to be assumed. I told him about the camp fees and the Florida trip and the steakhouse and the laptop. Not to itemize grievances, just so he knew I remembered, even when I hadn't said anything at the time. People think silence means forgetting. It doesn't. It means deciding for now not to speak. I told him about Frank, about how his father used to say that the clearest measure of a man's character was how he treated people when there was nothing in it for him. I told him I believed that was equally true of families. Then I folded the letter, put it in an envelope I bought at the front desk from Patrice, and mailed it from the post office in town, on my way out of Stowe. I was home by dinner time. I unpacked my bag. I put a load of laundry in. I made soup from a rotisserie chicken and the celery and carrots I'd left in the refrigerator before I went, and I ate it at the kitchen table with a novel propped open beside my bowl, the way I did most evenings. My phone was quiet. Renee called at 8 to make sure I'd made it home safely. We talked for 20 minutes. I told her about the snow and the dog with the yellow lab and Patrice and the French toast. "Do you feel better?" she asked. "I feel like myself," I said. "That's better than better." Nathan called the following Saturday. He didn't mention the letter right away. We talked around the edges of things for a few minutes, the boys, a project at work, the weather in Crestwood. Then he went quiet, and I waited, and he said, "I didn't know about the Ashford." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you didn't ask, I said, finally. Not about that, or about most of it. And I let that happen too. That's on me as much as it's on you. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, the same sound he made as a little boy when he was thinking hard about something, working something through. Some things don't change no matter how old your children get. Tiffany's embarrassed, he said. I imagine she is. She didn't know you'd worked there. She didn't know a lot of things about me, I said. She's never asked. Another silence. That's fair, he said finally, quietly, in a voice that reminded me so much of Frank that for a second I had to look away from the phone. Nathan, I said, I don't want an apology. Or, I do, eventually, but that's not the point right now. The point is that I'd like you to know me, your actual mother. The person who worked that office for 30 years and built something else after your father died and has read, at last count, over 800 books. I am more than what I can pay for. He said, I know that, Mom. I said, I don't think you've acted like you did. That was the hardest thing I'd said out loud to him in 38 years of being his mother. I felt it go out of me like something I'd been carrying in both hands. He didn't argue. He said, You're right. Just those 2 words, steady and without qualification. We stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes after that. I told him things I'd never thought to tell him before. About the early days at the law firm, about a particularly complicated case I'd helped manage the logistics of in 1994 that had been in the local news for months. About what it was like to start over at 63 and discover I was actually good at a whole new set of things. He listened. He asked questions, real ones. It was the best conversation I'd had with my son in years. In December, Nathan came by the house alone, without Tiffany, without the boys. He rang the doorbell, which he hadn't done since he was a teenager and had forgotten his key. He brought a plant, a small rosemary topiary trimmed into a Christmas tree shape, the kind they sell at garden centers in December. It was a silly, unpretentious, completely Nathan kind of gift, and it made me genuinely happy. We sat at the kitchen table, and he told me, without being prompted, about the Thanksgiving dinner at the Ashford Grand. How Drew the sommelier had come to their table and mentioned, without any fanfare, that he hoped they were enjoying themselves, and that it was always good to see guests who'd been connected to the resort before. How Tiffany had gone very still and said, politely, I'm sorry, what do you mean? And Drew had explained, with a professional's careful neutrality, that he'd worked under their guest's mother, the woman who'd run administrative operations during the renovation years. Wonderful woman, sharp as anything. He said that, Nathan told me. Sharp as anything. Drew was always kind, I said. Tiffany had apparently not said much for the rest of the meal. Alan and Cynthia, who had also heard, had seemed faintly puzzled by the whole thing. Kylie had simply looked at Tiffany with an expression Nathan described, carefully, as complicated. She's embarrassed, Nathan said again. But I think she's starting to understand. I nodded. I didn't need Tiffany to apologize to me at the kitchen table. I needed something more than that. Something that took longer to grow and couldn't be forced. But understanding was a start. I looked at the little rosemary tree on my counter and thought about what Harriet had said to me the week before I went to Vermont. She'd wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has known you through the hardest version of yourself and isn't going anywhere. And she said, You know the problem with being too capable, Diane? People mistake it for not needing anything. I'd thought about that sentence every day since. I was capable. I was capable and steady, and I had built and rebuilt my life in ways my children didn't know because I'd spent so long making it look effortless that they'd come to believe it required no effort at all. That was changing. Nathan was still at my kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the first real December snow was starting, soft, purposeful, the kind that stays. I got up and refilled both of our cups and came back and sat down, and we kept talking. I told him I was thinking about going to Italy in the spring. Not for Thanksgiving, not for any holiday occasion, not as part of a family plan requiring coordination and compromise and someone to pick up the tab. Just because Frank and I had always talked about Tuscany, and I was 67 years old, and the older I got, the more clearly I understood that the trips you keep meaning to take don't wait forever. Nathan looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was about 12, something open and a little surprised, like he was seeing something he'd managed, somehow, to overlook. "You should go," he said. "I know," I said. And I meant it, the way I meant very few things in my life, completely, without apology, without waiting for anyone's permission.